Yeah, so I mean, it's probably pretty obvious. I'm a big fan of storytelling as the framework from which we communicate our science. And I actually don't think that there's as big of a sort of rift between quantitative approaches and things like yarning and storytelling as what people might think. And it's also like they both have their
What
strengths.
is a quantitative approach? Just to bring that vocab into the recording.
Yeah, so a quantitative approach would be like collecting data, so running an experiment, giving people a bunch of different survey items and things like that, and then running your like t-tests, ANOVAs, whatever. And then a qualitative approach is doing interviews, focus groups, even open-ended questions in your survey where people can people basically have a voice in some way, and you're not controlling what their responses are to your questions.
Yeah.
And yeah, so and they both have their strengths and their weaknesses, which I think that in psychology, like there's more people doing qualitative work now, but there's not a lot of, I think, discourse I see about the fact that quantitative research has just as many problems as qualitative research. So for instance, like with sample sizes, we get like a representative sample in the hundreds or the thousands, but this comes at the cost of our participants' voices. So when you run a survey, you're essentially putting words into the mouth of your participants, and you're giving them a set a set of tools to respond to you, rather than letting them voice their own responses and take their answers where they would want to take them. And there's even experimental paradigms where you can actually manipulate like how salient something is to people by the way that you word those questions. So if you want them to feel good about their group memberships, you can ask them questions where they're going to respond in the affirmative. So things like, oh, I engage in most group activities. You can ask them that so that they can say yes, instead of like, I always engage in all activities, when they have to say no. And like, you can do stuff like that on purpose, but then also just as part of designing quantitative measures, we have to do that. Like, we have to design questions that we think will align with how our participants are thinking, and will tell us about a certain construct that we're looking at, but we don't actually know. We're putting words into the mouths of our participants. And qualitative methods don't give us that sense of representation necessarily. So you normally have a handful to like 30 or 40 people in a interview, or you have like a handful of people in a yarning circle, but it actually lets people tell you what they're interested in their own way and in their own words, and that's almost just as important as this representativeness. So they both have their strengths and weaknesses in terms of like letting us learn something. And talking about yarning circles in particular, which is probably a bit too complicated, and so definitely something I'm not an expert in, but it's where you get a group of usually Indigenous people, but there's different methodologies together, and it's a less directed form of something like a focus group, where the topic of research that you're looking in weaves in and out of the conversation as the sort of conversation and relationships develop between the researcher and the people in the focus groups and things like that. And what I really like about that idea, and what I really like about yarning circles, is that they allow for the messiness that is like human behavior and human life. It allows for participants to talk about the topic that you're interested in within the wider web of their lived experience, and it sort of brings in that sort of wider context of the topic that you're looking at. And I also really like that it doesn't dismiss the role of the researcher in the process. So quite often in psychology, we like to think that we're sort of standing away from humanity, looking at humanity, and that's not actually true. That we are humans looking at humans, and so it's always going to be have that extra layer of complexity of trying to work out how things work. But in yarning circles, it's one of the part of the key interpretation is actually the researcher in that process, and their relationship with the people, and their role in interpreting the discussion and things like that. I think that's a really nice way to recognize that lack of distance that we actually have between our subjects that we study.
So a yarning circle is a way that we as Indigenous communities can come together and we connect and we address the issue at hand, or we have conversations around together. There's no, we share the power, we share the speaking. We don't always share perspectives, but we talk through them. It's a really beautiful thing to be part of and watch. Absolutely. Me and a hell of a lot of other Indigenous and non-Indigenous academics support yarning circles. And what was the other one you talked about?
It's ways of discovering. It's a storytelling.
Oh, storytelling. Yeah, absolutely. Like, as I said before, I'm a storyteller.
Yeah.
And my experience is no less valid than anybody else's because of the way that I say it or describe it. So we live in stories, we learn in stories, we share stories. So they're a really inherent part. And despite some people maybe, sitting there and listening to a story from someone and being like, I have no idea how I got here. I think they're just such a gift that we can be given because there's so much learnings that we can make from them. And, the dreaming's based on a lot of stories about animals and creation and things like that. So despite them being in stories, does it mean that the learnings that we can't take from them are really valid and rigorous? I think we definitely can. And you're also talking to someone who used both these methodologies in her PhD and is currently writing that up.
Yeah, great. Well, I guess I want to explore that with yourself and the other guys because there's such a strong association, stigma, if you like, between the idea of anecdotal data as kind of the opposite of science. But what I think that needs to be brought to this conversation is how people are using the stories in the different cultural practices. So in the anecdotal data that scientists rightly criticize, part of it is coming up with a story based on some cherry-picked aspect and then telling it as if it's the story of the whole world. And that's not what we're talking about. That's actually the opposite of what we're talking about. With this practice, everyone gets to tell a story and everyone is heard. So it's not about cherry-picking and selecting. And it's also about everyone understanding what story is for. It's not for telling the story of the whole world. It's telling a story of you as an individual or of this part of the dreaming or of this part. And so it's learning about variability through examples, or as some people would say in CogPsych, you'd say exemplars, right? So instead of learning, I don't know if you relate to this, but I was trained this way. So instead of learning the prototype, like this is the prototype, like a bird is a bird, then we learn by exemplars, like there's a penguin, there's a hen, there's a hawk. So the Western tradition is like we've got to talk about averages and we've got to talk about, representing the entire population. And in order to do that effectively, we need numbers. That was the decision of the 1970s. Whereas the storytelling tradition is about, no, those numbers hide as much as a cherry-picked anecdote. The average is not you and it's not me. So let's each tell our stories. At least that's kind of how I relate to it now. I don't know how you would comment on that. So part of how storytelling is for discovery is understanding that you're telling your story or you're telling a story of a particular moment and you're learning it not as a generalization that applies to everyone, but learning it as the reality of who you are and what you're speaking from.
Yeah, absolutely. So your story is completely individual and, you own that. That's yours to do with what you want. When you collect and engage in, I used yarning, not so much circles, but yarning is methodology, so they're individual yarns. When you do that several times over and collect that, and then you analyze it using a very validated qualitative method, I don't understand how people can say that, like, you know, your synthesis turns out that there's a lot of commonalities between these people's experiences, from what you depicted in their story. There's rigor in that, and I think everything has a place. I think anyone that says things don't have a place are just a bit close-minded, quite frankly, because there's so many things that we don't know. So it's just so naive to think that things don't belong.
Once, many people would say qualitative methods can tell you what you don't know. Like, quantitative methods can tell you where people sit on a scale from 1 to 7, but qualitative methods can tell you people feel like they're 11, or they feel like they're not even on that scale. They're on a different scale. So although people are frightened of being unsciencey, I feel like part of this conversation is about understanding that to represent diversity and experiences that people have, and to represent like aspects of cultural knowledge that are outside scholarship, because it's a different cultural tradition, it would be just as unscientific to ignore that huge body of knowledge as to say, no, if it's not a numerical scale with a validated measure, I'm going to ignore it.
Yeah, it would be less rigorous of us to just do quant research.
Exactly.
It would be so much more exclusion in that context.
Yeah. And I think
really quant is the unsciencey one here.
Yeah. Well, I'm a quant researcher. I use mixed methods as well, right? And I've done fMRI studies, right? So I guess part of where I'm coming from is what's unsciency is dogmatism and refusing to hear someone's knowledge instead of being open to it. That's unscientific when you close your mind. That's the opposite. And I think when people are concerned about anecdotes, what they're concerned about is power tripping and selective reporting. And good qualitative methods don't allow that either, right? That would be unrigorous. That would not be appropriate. When you're power tripping as a researcher, you're doing bad science. I think we can agree on this.
Well, it's the same in quant studies, right? Where you can change the way that you group the data to get a significant result, or make it even a little bit more closer to significant than if it was before. So, I mean, it's the same. How can we ensure that people aren't grouping certain participants in a certain way to make them have this significant result and therefore a publishable finding?
Yeah, I really agree. It's distorting the data. It's not listening to the data. It's using your power, abusing your power to manipulate the data. Those are the dangers that scientific method is trying to guard against. But in its original formulation in the 70s, it was unscientific in like not letting in all this other knowledge. So it's good that we're evolving as a field. Yeah.
I really like to do things. I'm different. I'm a communicator, right?
Yeah.
But there might be some students that find it very difficult to communicate. If not, grab somebody else who is.
Yeah. Good advice.
Yeah, because I'm a communicator, therefore my research styles matches who I am. And so I do what I do best, and I love focus groups. I love working together with people on learning or doing things with them, and I find that works very well with me. And for example, I hold a monthly group with people, and I was going to cease it, and they said, please don't. The work we're doing is life-changing. And
awesome.
Really, really good about that, because I really don't sometimes, I mean, I can see people blossom and grow as I go along, but it's nice to hear that the work you're doing, the way you're doing it is effective. So, and that's, that's how we feed our soul, by doing it in the way we can. And that's what I want to get across. I think probably my final thing is don't see things as problems. See them as challenges. Think about the whole context of what needs to be done. Think about where you shine. and think about how you resource yourself. So you resource yourself with information, with people, with whatever it is that you need to get the job done. And you can do anything in the whole wide world if you approach it that way. And be like my 81-year-old grandma before she passed. She was at always, if she thought a certain way and you gave her more information, she was very willing to change the way she thought.
Yeah.
And she was a very intelligent lady, and someone to be respected and admired. So, always be true to yourself and true about yourself to other people. And in that way, you'll get the best outcomes from your research. Always be respectful and mindful of the group of people that you're studying, so that that each culture has its own nuances. So you need to not say that you're of that group, but you need to know how to work with that group. So you, along the way, you say, is this working, or what do I do? And then like, for example, you don't have ham sandwiches at a Muslim meeting, would you? That's a bit crass, saying that, but
it's an example of respect, basic respect, that's really easy to miss, right? Yeah.
So be yourself. Be confident, be open and approachable to learning. And so the journey you have with those people is also your journey, and you're building upon that. And then as an academic, you're sharing your learnings with other people. So you must make sure that they are not credentialed, I can't think the right word. Did you say valid or authentic, or no? It has to be academically rigorous.
Yeah. Do you mean share your academic research?
When you're sharing your learnings, it has to have that the rules around it, so that other people can then pick it up and work with it.
Yeah.
If it's too loose or ineffective or waffly, they can't get it. They can't take it along with them. It's like when you're trying to contrast apples with oranges. If you have it in the context of the apple, for the apple people to understand it and to pick it up and go with it. So whilst we have our own trajectory, we've got to be mindful of not only are we going to benefit the group we're with, but if you're going to be doing a paper or something like that, it has to be transferable. It has to be something that is written in the style or the way that academia require.
Yeah. And I think in psychology at UQ, we do a really good job at training people not to waffle. We do a good job at training them to report in a rigorous way, but it's still quite hard for students to think, will my paper be of use to anyone else? Can I speak in a way that other people can understand? And we're not going to necessarily solve that now, students, but I hope you feel really challenged and inspired by what you're hearing.